Welcome, everyone. I'm Professor Adam Mergian, Associate Professor here in the department, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce this discussion of Jennifer Vanderbes' new book, not least because we're college friends. We went to college together, and so it's a real delight to when a friend brings into the world something as exciting as a book, and especially a book that happens to intersect with your own geographic and intellectual interests. And so just to introduce Jen, she's the author of 3 novels, actually. This is her 3rd. The first, Easter Island, has been translated into 16 different languages. And it was named a Best Book of 2003 by both the Washington Post and the Christian Science Monitor. While Strangers at the Feast, her 2nd book, is followed now by this 3rd, Secret of Raven Point, which is a quote-unquote coming-of-age novel in World War II, of course, much more than that. And just to give you a sense of what readers are saying about it, that it's, quote, compulsively readable, yet profoundly mature. Another reader says, I tore through it in 3 days, but the characters will haunt me for much longer, which I thought was really quite a vivid thing to say about a read. And another writes, like Vanderbes' earlier novels, the writing is elegant, each sentence flawless. And the book has been reviewed in everything from Vogue to the Washington Post to Kirkus, so the most prominent journals around. Jen's essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. Her short fiction has appeared in Granta and Best New American Voices, and her first play, interestingly enough, Primating, which is about primatologists on a chimp reserve in Africa, was just optioned by the Tony Award-winning producer Jeffrey Richards. And Jen has been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Cullman Fellowship at the New York Public Library, a Colgate Creative Writing Fellowship, and a Truman Capote Fellowship. She received her BA in English from Yale and an MFA from the very distinguished Iowa Writers Workshop. And she is joined this evening by our very own Franco Baldasso, a recent PhD in this department. So when you meet him in the hall, congratulate him. He has filed his dissertation, which is titled very provocatively and lyrically, Against Redemption, the early post-war debate over the transition from fascism to democracy in Italy. He has himself, amazingly enough, published a book on the Holocaust survivor Primo Levi, titled Il cerchio di gesso, Primo Levi, narratore e testimone, which came out in 2007. And he is co-editing with Simona Wright an issue of NEMLA Italian Studies titled Italy in World War II and the Transition to Democracy, Memory, Fiction, Histories. His articles have appeared in Modern Language Notes, Context, NEMLA Italian Studies, Poetiche, and Scritture Migranti. So who else really better to dialogue with Jen over The Secret of Raven Point? And so with that, and without further ado, I very happily turn this over to both of them. So please join me in welcoming them.
Well, thank you very much, Ada, and thank you, Jennifer, for coming here today to the Casa Italiana for a very interesting, well, a presentation about a very interesting book that it's a novel about brutality and tenderness, a history of intimacy, and also a history about history, of becoming an adult and on the wounds that becoming an adult brings about. It's also a mystery book, and strangely enough, when I first read the flap cover of this book, I thought about a famous film. The first one is very famous, like MASH by Robert Altman, in which there was a, I mean, in 1917, then there was a famous TV series in which there were all the doctors and nurses going to the Korea War and like, you know, having a sort of crazy black comedy there. And also, and I think that was successful and became like part of American pop culture, not to say like global pop culture. But also I thought about another movie of some years ago, and this time a movie related to Italy, that is Spike Lee's Miracle at Sant'Anna, a movie that's about American soldiers in World War II in Italy. And a movie that created like triggered a lot of polemics in Italy for the depiction of the Italian landscape, of the Italian soldiers, of the Italian people that are very, very stereotypical. None of this was present in the book when I started reading it. No stereotypes, no black comedy, but instead an intense story about a person, you know, a very fragile person who tried to face the extreme in Italy. The protagonist that all the reviews loved, they talk about her like adorable, Juliette Dufresne, who is a very young girl from South Carolina who like went to nurse school despite she was very good at college, just to reach her brother who left the family's small town to go to fight for freedom on the Italian soil. The brother Tuck is missing in action, so nobody knows anything about him, but she, with a stubborn faith, pursue him in Italy. She wants to go there. She just has his letters that tell about stories about her, his companions, the other soldiers of the squadron in Africa, and then throughout the Italian peninsula until Rome. And she decided to go there in the very heart of this black continent that Europe became during the Second World War, to find traces of her lost brother. Juliette Dufresne is an amazing point of view within the war. Also because it triggers stories that are not exactly the first things that will come to mind when you think about Second World War, or on the other hand, when you think about Italy. Those are exactly the story that were at the center of a film like MASH, the story of a place within the whole setting of the war where the bodies of the people are literally fixed, which is the mobile hospital very close to the front. Mobile hospital because the front is shifting, the front is changing continuously. So the nurses there and also the doctors, they have to live a life that is completely, in a way, exceptional because they are in the very close to the front. But on the other hand, it's also kind of protected in a weird way, but protected just because they see death every day, but they're not personally part of this death. And Juliette will experience what it means to be scared of that, of dying, later on in the novel. Again, the novel is a sort of coming at age, is a sort of becoming an adult, and she will learn so much from this experience, and she will feel all over the novel very awkward, and that's why probably she's such a fascinating character. The surrounding context of this novel, of Juliette's story, is Italy, is this country that at the beginning looks like kind of untouched and far away, and the more the novel progresses, becomes something real, becomes something out of the cliche, out of the romanticization that so many books or so many films keep on pursuing of Italy. Becomes real also because of the many characters of this novel. There are so many very compelling characters that are fascinating or even repulsive in this novel, from all the people that come in the hospital. Some of them, of course, will never leave the hospital. Probably the majority of them Other people will leave the hospital, of course, not at a certain point of the nurses joke, but is of course a very black humor, not whole like they entered. And this is also another great theme of this book. The fact that instead of telling a story of redemption, instead of telling a story of courage and military courage, Jennifer decided to focus instead of the everyday courage of the nurses, and also of the everyday courage of all the people that are involved in fix, as literally the novel said, fix the parts of the body of this poor soldier that, good or bad, they are destined to, to leave Italy very, very scared, scarred, not just scared. So I just wanted to quote a couple of things because looking for the brother, she meets amazing people. First of all is the doctor Willard, that is like stubbornly prone to try all he can, all his science, all his personality is just to find a way to cure these people. First, because as a duty, he has to fix them to the war, to go back to the front. But second, because he really wants to save them. Also, he wants to save them psychologically, because he knows that the wounds created by the war, the traumas created by the war, are probably more incurable than the one of the body. And second, another mysterious character that is a great part of the mystery of the whole novel. It's Barnaby. The name is already quite interesting because it reminds me of Melville's character that repeats for the whole story. I prefer not to. And it's a character that really really stands out in the situation, both physically, both mentally, and for many other reasons that probably Jennifer would love to talk about later. And this character is in a coma, but Willard said, hey, probably this guy can be saved. And only through saving this guy, that by the way was in direct contact with Tuck, the brother of Juliet, probably only saving this guy, there will be a meaning in all the mess and all the wreckage that happened down there in Italy. So yeah, I'm just quoting a couple of sentences from the discussion that Willard and our protagonist Juliet will have. That probably they just sum up the meaning and the real direction of this very good read. Why curing the men for sending them back to the front? There is no right in these works, only degrees of less awful, which also showcases how one of the main contents of the novel is the morality, not just of the war, but of working within the war. And second one is, it is impossible to ask men to do what they do out there and then not have it change them. Which means that, which deals probably with the most important issue, and also to my first question to Jennifer, it deals to the big problem of trauma that is the fil rouge of this whole novel, and in particular of post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah, I think this is just a sketch of what's going on in this novel, but probably Jennifer has much more interesting things to say. And let's start with, yeah, why such a difficult topic as post-traumatic stress disorder to write a book on? So I just throw in this big theme here.
Sure. So I think that most people associate the beginning, or at least the American consciousness, the sort of discussion of PTSD, most people sort of trace it back to World War I and shell shock, and that's sort of the first time that enters the conversation as this bad thing that can happen that's not a physical injury on the battlefield. And actually, the very first mention of anything that's sort of connected to PTSD is a couple sentences in Herodotus about a soldier in battle who is basically suddenly stricken with blindness that is not physical when he sees his friend die. And then you have, in the American Civil War, we start discussing something in literature called a soldier's heart, which is, again, this constantly trying to find different terminology for the sort of same circumstances, something going wrong with men when they're fighting that doesn't have to do with a physical ailment. And then in World War I, shell shock becomes this big part of the conversation. I didn't realize when I set out to write a World War II book that I would be writing about what in World War II, battle fatigue and combat exhaustion, that was the sort of terminology of that era. But I was completely surprised in my research to realize that actually the incidence of PTSD, battle fatigue, in World War II were about 2 to 3 times the incidence of World War I. It was very strange to me that we hadn't historically absorbed that part of the war, that World War I was the kind of shell shock war, and somehow in everything that we absorbed about happening in World War II, that wasn't sort of part of what we were aware of. And there's actually a very good reason for that, which is that the American government became very uncomfortable with the idea of battle fatigue and combat exhaustion. Whether they felt like it was just the mere discussion of it was demoralizing to soldiers, and particularly after the war, when we were really happy about the outcome and we felt very patriotic and good about what Americans had done, there were still lots of soldiers returning who were suffering varying degrees of this condition. And John Huston made a film called Let There Be Light in around 1946 that followed some soldiers suffering from combat exhaustion in a veterans hospital. And the story of this film is that when they tried to, the government basically censored it, and when they tried to have a screening at MoMA, you actually had military people coming in and taking the film reel. And that just gives you a sense of the climate around the level of comfort with people talking about this as a phenomenon. And I think it was in the early 60s that they actually remove the phrasing from medical literature. It's not a diagnosis. By the time we're in Vietnam, there is nothing in medical texts that we can say this is what's happening to these guys. And it doesn't get back into medical literature until I think the early 80s. So, you know, not that one sets out to write a novel that's instructive, but it is really interesting when you're doing research and you find things that surprise you as a researcher, a reader. And it simply astounded me how much combat exhaustion was part of the World War II experience, how it had absolutely been sort of censored out of the record, among many other things that would be, I think, you know, interesting to talk about. And so I just, you know, I absolutely had to have that in the story. It was very important to me. And you mentioned Dr. Willard, who is the sort of mentor of Juliet, the main character. And this is Dr. Willard's passion. He's a psychiatrist, and he is in there working in a field hospital, desperately trying to fix these men mentally and emotionally. You know, all the while doing work that nobody really wants to even talk about being necessary. And, you know, and as you mentioned, he became an interesting character, in particular because it seemed to present a really awful moral quandary for a doctor when your job is basically to, there's some moment in the book where he explains to Juliet that, you know, these men are shaking and trembling and they're absolutely scared to death. And, you know, that's not wrong in war. That's actually a very normal response to the situations that these characters were in. And what it does to him as a character to be in a position where his job is to try to sort of mentally and emotionally mend these soldiers who were all the goal was, the only reason the government posted, you know, not him, he's a fictional character, but doctors, and set up psychiatric stations, was that they needed these men back fighting. And I wouldn't want to have that job as a psychiatrist. I mean, you know, most people treating people with PTSD outside of, you know, a field hospital are doing it after a war in a situation where they're treating someone coming back home. The goal is not to send them right back in. The other interesting thing I came across in the research was that the particularly strange thing about the fact that the incidents in World War II of combat fatigue were so much higher than World War I is that during the draft, you know, they had these examinations which, again, you know, reading about the way that they conducted the physical exams and the mental exams, as a contemporary reader, you cannot believe that this happened. I mean, there were doctors who were so determined to exclude homosexuals from the military experience and were convinced that some ratio of like leg length to pubic bone. You know, I mean, they really had crazy, crazy theories about how to detect all sorts of deviances. What they did, though, is they included in the interview questions that they thought would weed out the people. Their response to the World War I shell shock was there must have been something wrong with those particular guys, right? So, of course, they think very cleverly, well, we'll have this be part of the conversation early on. We'll make sure that the weak and the this and the that and the troubled don't end up there. And if anything proves how sort of natural and endemic something like combat fatigue is the fact that after all that effort, the rates were much higher, and it simply has nothing to do, and it's a very unfortunate conversation even today about the sort of soldiers' experience. This is not about, you know, and nowadays it includes women as well suffering from PTSD, but at the time and predominantly historically, this is not a weakness of particular men. And, you know, and again, the government treating it as something embarrassing, I think, did a great disservice. Yep. To all the men who fought. Yeah,
it's very interesting what you mentioned about, by the way, it's present in the book with appalling pages about the treatment. These doctors were submitting their, these poor people coming from all over the US, but it's also interesting how the paradigm, the scientific paradigm that was behind all these practices is not that far from the scientific paradigm behind the same practices that were going on in fascist Europe. Of course, the outcome is totally different. Also, there is there's another morality behind it. But again, let's think about the scientific idea behind choosing a determinate and very specific specimen of man that is able for battle. So I just throw this idea out there, and maybe you can talk about it much more. But since all your characters are so full-fledged, I would love you to read one part of your book that maybe express these concerns, and I think that's the best way to enter in this great novel.
Okay, so since we just spoke a little bit about the sort of battle fatigue, I will read a section where Dr. Willard and Juliet are working with the patient Barnaby that Franco mentioned, and so he enters the field hospital very early on in the novel, and he has attempted suicide on the battlefield. He's put a bullet through his head and has somehow miraculously survived, but and has not just survived, but effectively has not, by any way they can detect, been physically harmed other than the sort of physical injury. His brain has not been damaged by this, but he is mute. And before I read this, I just want to say, again, the really fun thing about doing historical research is that sometimes you really can't believe that these things actually happened. And I never personally understood that truth serum, you know, various drugs that can induce people to a sort of relaxed mental state to say all sorts of things really work. And this was one of the various practices that was going on during World War II. And there are really cool government films from this time that you can see these actual interviews conducted, if anybody, you know, finds that as neat as I do. Okay. Rain fell in thick sheets the next evening, hitting the mud so forcefully the ground seemed alive. Juliet met Dr. Willard in the recovery tent, where they lifted Barnaby onto a litter and draped him with a poncho before carrying him through the rain to the isolation ward. The tent was small and dark and smelled so fiercely of bleach that Juliet coughed. She stared at the rectangular shadow of the single bed, empty since Private Blakely had succumbed to pneumonia that morning. This was her least favorite area of the hospital. This was where people came to die. They set the litter atop the bed, and Dr. Willard lit a kerosene lamp. In the corner sat a glass-covered contraption the size of a typewriter. It was plugged into the tent's sole electrical cord. Juliet toweled the rainwater from her face and studied the machine. That, Willard explained, is so that we don't have to rely on memory. He sifted through his black bag and extracted a syringe. From a small velvet-lined box, he took a glass vial labeled XR529 and handed it to her. Willard had explained little to Juliet ahead of time about the nature of what they would be doing with Barnaby, and she now felt entirely bewildered. She had assumed they were going to be reading him more letters. She didn't want to reveal her utter inexperience, but she also didn't want to make a mistake, not with a patient and a dosage. We inject him with this XR529, she asked, studying the vial. 5 milliliters? Sodium pentothal. You've seen it used for anesthesia, but in large doses. 5 milliliters will slow his respiration and pulse, just enough to make him suggestible. I want to start with a low dose to see how he handles it, so we may have only 15 minutes. You monitor his vitals. I record and take notes of what he says. What he says? She studied the vial. This will wake him from his coma? If I'm right that we're not just witnessing the effects of a brain injury, but that much of this coma is actually psychosomatically induced withdrawal, and let's hope I'm right, then the pentothal will temporarily ease him out of that withdrawal and allow him to talk. That will begin the process of rousing him from his coma. Imagine it this way. His mind has hundreds of doors to all kinds of memories and experiences. Right now, many of those doors are locked, but when we ask him questions, slowly, one by one, some of those doors will come unlocked. After the pentothal wears off, he won't even know we were looking. Now let's get him upright. Together they propped Barnaby against the wall of the tent. Willard drew up a chair to face Barnaby and flipped open the glass-covered contraption. He unwound a cord from a microphone and laid the microphone on Barnaby's chest. He gestured for Juliet to sit on the bed beside Barnaby, then handed her a stethoscope, needle, and syringe. As rain drummed on the canvas overhead, she carefully injected the pentothal into Barnaby's arm. She held his wrist to monitor his pulse. She wanted to believe what Willard had said, but something in her doubted a mere injection would rouse a man who had been unresponsive to all human interaction, to the entire world, for more than a week. And who knew what permanent damage lurked in his brain? Dr. Willard leaned forward. "Private Barnaby," he said, "you're going to relax now and feel very calm, absolutely at ease. Not a care in the world. Private Barnaby, can you hear me?" Barnaby remained still, but Juliet felt his pulse begin to slow. He released a long, noisy exhalation, and then, from the depths of his thickly bandaged face, like a righted doll, his good eye flashed open. Startled, Juliet dropped his wrist. His iris was a dark mahogany. The upper lashes were short and thick, but the lower lashes were pale and thin, and beneath the eyes spread fine, papery wrinkles. She stared at this one piece of him, trying to grasp the whole. It was like looking the wrong way through a peephole. Finally, his gaze moved toward Dr. Willard, who offered a proud smile, as though Barnaby were a student with the correct answer. "Hello, Christopher," he began. Sorry, his full name is Christopher Barnaby. "Could you tell me where you're from?" Barnaby's lips fluttered, light as butterfly wings, as if trying to remember the shapes of words. "Burlington," he said slowly. "I'm from Burlington, Vermont." It was strange to hear his voice, husky and soft. He spoke in the long, warped tones of someone with a toothache. "Your rank?" "Private. First class." The words came gradually, unsteadily, and Juliet wondered if something in his mind wasn't working properly. "So I'd like to talk a little, get to know you. Is that okay?" "Uh-huh." "What did you do before the war, Christopher?" "Worked at the paper, the local paper, setting the type." "Did you like that?" "I liked reading the articles before anyone else, and I liked figuring out how to change words here and there so they fit. It was like a puzzle. I was good at it." His speech was flowing easily, quick and confident. "You're in a hospital right now, in Italy, making a wonderful recovery from a gunshot wound. Do you recall your injury?" "I've been to Italy?" He scratched at his head, a small, simple gesture, but the motion of his arm stunned Juliet. It was the first time she'd seen him voluntarily move. "Christopher, would you raise your right arm for me?" "Excellent. And now your left? Brilliant. Let's continue. You came to Italy with the United States Army." "Screw the Army." "You don't like the Army?" "I don't like what I ate, and I don't want to talk about it. Stop making me talk about it." "What you ate?" "It was right there in my meat tin, I swear." Barnaby winced as though he were smelling something rotten. Willard moved the recording device closer. "Can you tell me about this meat tin, Christopher? You don't have to tell me what you ate. Just tell me what was happening before." The yellow lamplight wavered across Barnaby's bandaged face. His eyes seemed mildly bloodshot, and an ash-gray half-circle cradled the skin below. He looked harried, exhausted, which was strange, thought Juliet, since by all appearances he'd been asleep for days. Barnaby blinked several times, thoughtfully, dreamily, and Juliet felt uneasy. The violations of privacy that came with her job always made her uncomfortable. Often, when cutting the clothes off a patient and stripping him down to nothing, she felt a deep sense of transgression. But this was worse. To have a conversation with a person who didn't know he was having a conversation, who might confess his darkest fears and later have no recollection, what right had they? The whole company's encamped in a forest one night, Barnaby continued, and Captain comes by to visit the squad. We're all eating dinner, sitting on logs and packs, having a hot stew for the first time in weeks. And suddenly I get up to take a piss. Captain calls out to me, "Get yourself the hell out of my eyesight, Barnaby. I don't even want to feel the breeze that touched your crooked cock." He was always saying he didn't want to. He was always saying he didn't want me to contaminate the squad. He liked that word, contaminate. They all liked it. Anyway, I'd gotten used to it, and you got to do what the captain says. So off I went. It was one of those noisy nights where the sky was crackling. I walked a good 5 minutes away. I was half unzipped behind a tree when a massive boom tore through the sky, and things started falling through trees. I could see smoke in the distance. I rushed back to the squad. I thought we were under attack, but by the time I got to where they were all sitting, I heard everyone cheering. I grabbed my bowl and sat down, eating quietly, trying to figure out what had happened. I was spooning it out and came upon these chunks of meat, but something I bit into wasn't cooked, and I spit that thing out. Then I moved my spoon around. Barnaby's knee, limp until now, began to tremble. "Your spoon, what happened?" "I saw him watching me." "Who?" "Him." A tear sprung loose from Barnaby's eye and disappeared behind his gauze. His voice grew quiet, almost a whisper, a child's whisper. "Right there in my bowl, he was staring at me." Barnaby hugged himself and began to rock. Willard glanced at Juliet. "What was in your mess tin?" Barnaby sniffled. "The bluest eye I've ever seen." I'll pause there. That is one of the gorier moments in the book. You know, the other aspect, sort of historically, of how World War II was digested in the American consciousness, and I'd be interested actually to know about how it was digested in the Italian consciousness.
Well, yeah, there's a lot to say about that.
But we, you know, we definitely, for a long time, World War II was the good war, and increasingly became the better, happy, not happy war, but the sort of, the war that made us happy to think about in retrospect as time went on, and a lot of that also had to do with a kind of informal censorship. And when I started researching this book around 2003, it was really, boy, I used to know the statistic of how many World War II veterans are dying per day, but it's a lot. And I started to find a real explosion of self-published memoirs and collections of letters and journals and a lot of stuff on the web. And there was a real sudden sense of urgency among the people who participated in this conflict to talk about what had happened, what they had done, and it was very different from the sort of histories that had been compiled earlier on. And it was a lot more uncomfortable and a lot more gory and a lot more morally challenging than the way that we have or had really thought about the war. And I had a really interesting conversation many months ago with a veteran from Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's particular interest now among contemporary veterans to really talk more honestly as well about World War II, because they feel like they are somehow uniquely designated as these soldiers who have, you know, taken part in all this sort of bad behavior while at war, as though there is some way to have a 5-year conflict involving many countries and continents where everybody, at least we believed on the American side, conducted themselves well. So anyway, this was some attempt to get into some of the darker patches of that.
Yeah, and I have to say that from an Italian perspective, what I really enjoy of this book is also the accuracy of the contextualization and the historicization of the conflict. Because first of all, as you said, the World War II was basically the big war where John Wayne came in Normandy, broke a leg, and then was able to go to fight again. And the Italian idea of that changed through time, of course, right in the 40s and 50s. That was the war where finally the Italians had the chance to demonstrate to the whole world they were not just Mussolini. But later on, this idea just crumbled because it was based on a lot of delusions. There were, of course, a lot of people who rebelled against the fascist rule, but most of the people were just decided not to take any choice. And I don't think we are here to denounce that or to be, you know, to cast a moral judgment on this. The fact is, the Second World War was a war where situations like you described aptly in your book were common, and not just for soldiers, not just for doctors, were common for a lot of people, for people from civilians who just to give you an example, the norm for civilians was wreckage not just because of the Nazi conquering or occupying your towns, but also because of the bombings. There are historical research saying that in Italy, the bombings of the Allies that didn't stop when Italy declared that declared her shift from fighting against the Allies to fighting against the Germany. So the bombings didn't stop there. So we have like several years of bombings, and the memory of people is that these bombings, a lot of the time, were associated with the Nazis in their memory, but actually they were Allied bombings. So there is a lot of knots that are still far from being knotted in Italian memory. And a novel like this, I would love to have it translated in Italian, as I told you before, because it's also a way to, to cast a different eye on a conflict that it was not exactly so glorious as it has been depicted for decades. And just another question that you mentioned before, First World War, and First World War has always been the Great War, but also maybe because it's 100 years this year, and it will be 100 years for Italians next year, since we enter in the war with some delays. So basically, this war was the first real modern war, the first war where the bodies of the people took like center stage, just because of the new, the new possibility of warfare and so on and so forth. Well, for instance, I have to say that if you want to know more about the First World War, faculty from our department, particularly Ruth Benguia, which is a professor of Italian history, organized a set of interviews with the prominent scholars about First World War on CNN. And we also have an interview about modern art with Professor Aramerjan, who described the big shift that occurred exactly in those years, which is a shift on how to see the world, basically. And the First World War, also because of all the traumatic consequences, really changed the perception of time, of space, and what can be considered human. But I'm curious now, because despite all that has been written about First World War, you decided to choose a Second World War, and you didn't choose, for instance, the Vietnam War, that is probably the biggest scar in the American self-perception. And there are a lot of links of First World War in your book, and particularly the father of Julie. And I would like you to say some more about these links and this, continuity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, I wanted, the time lapse and between World War I and World War II, you really have almost an exact generation. And you have a lot of the same countries participating. And in the opening of the novel, where Juliet is home in South Carolina, I was really interested in this plays out more so with her brother Tuck, who, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, there was obviously a great sort of, swell of patriotism, mm-hmm. and a lot of young men who, a very different landscape than obviously the United States today. You do not have people rushing that much to go abroad and fight for the military. But Pearl Harbor was that moment for a lot of young men, and he's very young, he's very idealistic, and it was very important to me for him to have a father who had served in World War I as a doctor, who had seen war. And you have this really interesting and sort of painful discrepancy between what war sounds like and looks like when you haven't stepped into it yet, and a parent who has already seen what what these characters are going to see in the course of the novel. Different conflict, but certainly when you're talking field hospitals, the field hospitals in World War I and World War II were not vastly different. That emotional experience of just kind of the carnage of it. And I was, I was sort of heartbroken to imagine how hard it would be for a parent who absolutely knew what their child was about to experience, to have to contend with, someone saying, I'm going off to do this. I chose World War II, going back to the way that World War II is positioned in the American consciousness. I started the book around 2003 when we as a country were getting into another war. And there were just a lot of conversations at the time about the nature of war. And I wanted at the time to look at a conflict that was pretty depoliticized. And Vietnam is such a politicized conversation. It's very hard to look at that war and look at it in terms of the nature of war and what it does to people, because there were so many other factors going into it. So World War II, I sort of fell for it myself initially. I thought, oh, well, this is the sort of clear-cut moral, the moral conversation is sort of aside, we don't have to worry about that. And let me just look at the actual experiences of, the day-to-day, the sort of the grit of what people going into this go through. And it became, one of the reasons that Italy fascinated me was that it was a long war involving a lot of, places, and we as Americans were so proud of Normandy, with good cause, but you realize that the way that, history plays out, where we sort of pick and choose the moments of the war that make us feel the best. And so France, really, you get a lot more information when you're studying as an American, reading about World War II, you get a lot more information, D-Day, France, that period, and people often forget, and I certainly, again, I was not an expert in World War II before writing this, and I'm not an expert now. I wish, I had wanted to be going in, and I realized I would not live long enough to read all the material ever written about World War II. It's, could fill libraries. But that the war in Italy was still going on, and it wasn't just sort of forgotten historically, but actually at the time. I mean, a lot of troops were withdrawn from Italy to go fight in France. A lot of supplies were withdrawn, and you had American soldiers, fighting through the winter into the Apennines, and they didn't have boots, and they didn't have proper winter gear, and that became an interesting part of the conversation to me, because it felt like something that wasn't well known.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting. Also because in your book you point out that at a certain point the mutilated soldiers in the hospital, they feel like we have been forgotten. This is the forgotten front, which is exactly, by the way, what the Italian partisan felt in the winter of 1944-1945. I had the pleasure of interviewing a lot of partisans when I was in Italy, particularly in Bologna, that was very close to the front, and there was something like 10 of thousands of partisans, young people. They were like between 16 to 26 years old, together, waiting for the final push to get rid of the fascists, to get rid of the Nazis. And they were all in the big cities for Italy, like Bologna and Florence. There are 300,000 people. So they were coming from the countryside. And all these people, with everything they had, like from a knife to like a gun that they probably stole from a dead Nazi or fascist soldier, they were gathering in these big cities. So the cities were full of people that were ready for battle. But then arrived what they all remember as the Proclama Alexander. Alexander was the general in charge of the Italian front, and he was British, and he said that we're just going to stop on the Apennines, and we're not going to push it through the north of Italy, because the important, of course, he didn't say that in his Proclama to Italy, but that was the meaning. The important front now is the one in France, also because the Russians were pushing hard on the Eastern Front. So the Allies, there were already some disagreement on how to conduce the war, but the Italian front was not anymore the important one. So there were tens of thousands of these partisans that were basically waiting for the tanks, and they were very easy target now in Italian cities, because one thing is to hide in the Apennines or in towns that you know very well, and of course for the fascists and for the Nazi militia it was difficult to spot them. But another thing is having a guerrilla warfare in a city, and it was one of the first guerrilla warfare. You have also to consider Warsaw, for instance. There was they were doomed to death, and there were in Bologna, for instance, there was a lot of wars that still remember with a lot of pain, but with a lot of pride, because they were kind of left alone. On the other hand, Italy was a country who waged war first, so the situation became more and more complex. Going back to the American soldier who lost their lives and lost their limbs, or at any rate they lost a kind of part of their future, it was a very, very, very weird turn for them, because they just understood that their efforts were not central also for the glory of winning this war against the evil. So that's why I really like the historical setting, because we never concentrate on the fact that a war, of course, has many fronts, but there are also a lot of internal fronts. And the partisans after Second War and a lot of combatants against the Nazis became heroes in Italy. But there were something like 700,000 people who were in the Italian army and refused to fight for the Nazis and were just sent to camps in Germany, in Poland, and so on and so forth. And they came back and they were loyal to Italy. They didn't want to fight for Germany, and they were just basically dismissed by the Italian government after the war, because they represented the lost war, the Mussolini's war. So I was talking about different fronts. There is an internal front that I found fascinating. That is the front represented by the main character, by Julie. And yeah, it's the main point of view within the novel, and of course it's a very different novel from all the many soldiers and generals we talked about so far. And I would like you to introduce your main character and say something about that. Mm-hmm. Because
yeah, so outside of the sort of larger context of World War II, and thinking about Italy being an interesting front and battle fatigue being an interesting topic, at a certain point, I think, when I had to settle on the point of view for the novel, mm-hmm. I was really aware that the book was going to be so dark and gloomy that the only way to sort of take the edge off that was to sort of have all of this stuff encountered by a very sort of innocent and hopeful young person who was still young enough and hopeful enough to absorb it all without completely being emotionally or mentally destroyed by it. And she also, in most of the things that I write, I'm always very interested in placing women in men's worlds. And obviously war and combat is traditionally thought of as a man's world. And if you were a woman in World War II, the closest you could get to the action was to work in a field hospital. And it was the experience of a lot of women when at Pearl Harbor, when we were bombed at Pearl Harbor, there was something like 1,000 American nurses working for the Army. Within months, there were 12,000, and by the end of the war, there were 60,000. And this was also a massive recruitment effort that the government undertook, and they really pitched in all sorts of ways. And my favorite was a poster that reads, "Save his life and find your own." And it's a very sort of dewy-faced young woman in a very beautiful little white nursing cap. But just as Tuck enters with sort of romanticized ideas about the heroism that he's going to be able to embrace when he goes to fight for the good cause. Juliet is more immediately motivated by trying to find her brother, but she also, everybody, as humans do, has a very good take on themselves and how they will react in difficult situations. And as life generally shows us, we do not do not necessarily always meet our own expectations. And I really, was interested in capturing the experience of a woman going into a man's world in this way, and how not just the sort of the actual story of the war and her quest to find her brother, but how she would change as a person throughout the process. And so she has this very close working relationship with Dr. Willard. And
of course, there is some romance going on at a certain point.
Yeah, but I will say I had read so many war romances and seen so many movies, and I felt very strongly, probably to the chagrin of my publisher, that I would not write a book in which war was a vehicle for falling in love or finding your soulmate. I just, again, to me that's a slightly pernicious way of like thinking about war. And in some ways sort of short sells what actually the sort of day-to-day of what happens. So she does grow in her feelings, and but it's not one should never criticize The English Patient, the book or the movie, because it is, I would give all of my limbs to have written that or made that movie. That said, it is romantic. It is romantic in ways that something in me has a little bit of trouble with. And it's sort of where the romance starts to overshadow the actual story of the war and the conflict. And again, it's not alone in that. This is, this tends to be the trope, war is really bad, but you might just find the great passion of your life. So Juliet matures as a human being and as a woman, and she has a very complicated relationship with Dr. Willard. The relationship that I was interested in writing about, and perhaps there are women in the audience that this will resonate with, is the sort of mentor-student relationship that I think young women, and this may happen to men as well, but at a certain age where it's very easy to confuse passion and admiration, and that moment where you think that somebody is such an incredible human being, and you kind of just want to be them, and it sort of takes a turn. You don't know if you want to be them, be with them, but there's such a swell of admiration when you haven't fully lived life yet and you encounter someone who has so much more experience and seems so dazzling that those relationships, again, seem very unique to a certain era of one's life and don't get replicated in adulthood, or not in my experience. So I will read a brief portion. Oh boy, here we go. Really something short, just to give a taste of how she's changing, and what this means to her, and a brief escape from the environment of the war. So this is a moment when they are on leave from the field hospital, Juliet and Dr. Willard. They had spent the morning visiting the evacuation hospital, shadowing their field hospital, inquiring into the status of the patients they had transferred. They visited several stores commandeered by the Army to sell non-essential provisions. They bought wool socks for the cold weather ahead. Willard purchased a leather-bound notebook and a new ribbon for his typewriter. They purchased fresh bread and chocolate and oranges and picnic in the Boboli Gardens before wandering through the Palazzo Pitti. It was the first sightseeing Juliet had ever done. She was in a European city, wandering centuries-old royal buildings, and it humbled her. Everything in her new life would have once seemed improbable to her younger self, tucked away in her bedroom in Charlesport. Much of what had happened had been arduous and gloomy, but now she was a tourist in Florence. Juliet felt adventurous and romantic, as though she had stepped out of her life and of herself. She and Willard wandered happily, and by the afternoon had said nothing of the war, of Barnaby, or of the hospital. Together they marveled at the beauty of Florence, as though strangers on a walking tour. Willard knew a great deal about the history of the city, and Juliet enjoyed listening to him. He explained that the first opera in the entire world for which any music survived had been performed in 1600, right there in the Palazzo Pitti, where they were standing. He touched his heart and gazed silently at the frescoed ceiling of the Galleria Palatina. He closed his eyes and let his head sway, as though hearing the music. He told her about the lives of Verdi and Rossini, his favorite composers. He said that his dream as a young boy, long before he knew anything of medicine, was to become an opera singer. He seemed a different man here, relaxed, talkative, passionate about art and music. He, too, had stepped out of himself, and Juliet felt something contracting between them. The reserve had vanished. They walked side by side, their elbows brushing, their steps occasionally synchronized. But as they left the Palazzo Pitti and the sun began to set, she had the awful sense that the day was slipping from her, that this feeling, this happiness at escaping herself and the war, this sense of intimacy with Willard, would vanish. She wanted to walk slowly, to hold on to everything. She wanted to taste the air and listen to the sound of their footfalls. She wanted to study the way Willard would half gesture at the facade of a building while she offered a of agreement. It felt as if they had always been that way, and she wanted it to go on forever. She had never known that a single day with a single person could seem like the entirety of your life. Nightfall loomed like a small death, an agonizing departure from a moment she knew she would always long for. I also wanted to, most of the novel in Italy is set in a field hospital, which is really just a lot of tents in one field and then another. And I wanted that sense of history, and I wanted a moment where they could be in Italy and actually absorb the sort of history of Italy outside of that particular conflict. So that was a moment to sort of, hey, Italy's, tourism for Italy. It's not all war.
Well, of course, but I have to say that I was very curious before starting reading this novel how Italy could affect the story, could affect the plot, like the allure on one hand, but also the raw facts of the Italian campaign. That we were talking about First World War before, but historians say today that what happened in Monte Cassino with the trenches was as bad as the trenches of Verdun and the Somme. So there are these two different points: the Italy as a context, and also with a number of other characters that pop up at a certain point in the narration. And it's very interesting that the beginning of the novel, when the protagonist is still very young, but young in a sense that she's unexperienced, it doesn't matter where she is, basically. It's not that Italy comes out as a place able to say something to her. She's just there in the hospital, and that's her whole world. Page by page, with the growth of the person comes also the growth of what she's doing there, that the acknowledgement that the world is bigger than her own hospital and what she thought it was before. And at a certain point she's thinking, so what are the Italians doing during the war? What is going on with all the civilians they see fleeing after the bombings? And there's tons of remarkable passages, but instead of quoting them, I would love to ask you how.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to open it up to the audience.
Okay.
So selfishly, with regard to, you can finish your question and then maybe we'll open it up.
Sure. Okay. Well, I just finished this question, and maybe, of course, we're going to open the table to discussion with you. And my idea was just what's the role of how the country, how the surrounding affected the writing of the novel, also with your research. Mm-hmm.
It was a great excuse to take a trip to Italy. And there's nothing like being able to write off, roaming around Tuscany on your taxes. But it was almost unfortunate because I find Italy, as a country very interesting, that my awareness that so much of what the people both fighting and serving in hospitals there were not experiencing Italy in a normal, visitor's fashion. There are moments, of course, where there are partisan fighters in the hospital that become a part of the story, and there are a few moments, and it sort of plays a more integral role in the end of the novel, where they are going to find this partisan fighter's parents. And I wanted as much as possible to have glimpses of how the war was affecting Italian civilians. And there are two children, a brother and sister, two Italian children who come to the hospital at one point. And I think they're like 8 and 10, and they call themselves partisan fighters, and they have all this sort of like American, military sort of leftovers that they've collected. And they've lost their parents to the American bombing. And that was their story, and it's not a large part of the novel, but it weaves throughout, was probably the hardest part of the novel to write, and to really be aware of, again, how the war affected the civilians, and again, particularly children. So I would say I don't, in terms of the novel and its sort of examination of Italian culture, it's not so much that as the very sort of specific experience of what the Italian civilians were going through in a country that was sort of being, you know, ravaged in different ways by different sides at all times. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. And since the time is running fast, maybe you can go to the questions.
I want to selfishly ask one myself, which is sort of on the heels of Franco's, which is, what is your, you know, because it's a historical novel, what is your strategy for kind of finding sources, and how do you bring to life the detail of the historical context? I mean, is it newspapers, is it archives, is it personal narratives and memoirs?
I became a lot more interested in the personal narratives and memoirs than in, you know, sort of overall historical text. The sort of, you know, World War II histories were a good starting point, just to kind of, you know, as a primer for, okay, you know, what was going on in Italy in these years. In terms of the details, I feel like as a fiction writer, I'm always looking for the really sort of resonant details about, you know, what they were eating, and you know, there's a scene in the hospital where somebody shoots a chicken, you know, and they're you know, no one's eaten a chicken in months, and it's like, you know, everyone's sort of variously trying to sort of, you know, wrangle it, and it's sort of like, just to hell with it, like, you know, I'm just going to shoot the damn thing and let's just cook it now. That sense of the day-to-day really came from, there are a lot of doctors who wrote about their experiences in field hospitals, a lot of nurses. And for the combat experiences, again, there were a lot of infantry soldiers who were, like I said, late in life. These were not memoirs that were coming out within, you know, 20, 30 years after the war. They were really coming out late, but that were phenomenally detailed in terms of what was, you know, what the actual experience were like. That was really interesting. And again, one of the things to keep in mind, you know, there were vast numbers of people who had these experiences, and they were very varied. And so, you know, I could read 100 memoirs of, you know, combat infantry, you know, fighting on the American side in Italy, and that's it's a very small fraction of experiences that you're taking from. So you know, you're really kind of picking and choosing things that are resonant to create a story that you hope kind of captures the overall experience in some way.
Right.
Yes, please.
I think we had a similar reaction to Franco's last question. Also, it's related. If the last one was about challenges you might have experienced by Italy's kind of geographical otherness, and I was also interested in the challenges inspired me by kind of this temporal otherness of the story that's back. So I wonder if there are times when psychologically you had to find yourself making this psychology contemporary to the time, and resisting something, or writing a character or scene a certain way and finding actually maybe that's anachronistic based on how the relations between men and women, or the relations between different languages and cultures.
Right. I find one of the hardest things about writing historically about any period, maybe before the 60s, that there was so much censorship and self-censorship going on, where if you were to watch, say, movies of the 30s, your impression would be that human beings did not have sex, that people didn't swear, and you find this both, again, in movies, and you find this in written texts. That there was just a prudishness, a politeness about not talking about certain things. So it becomes very hard when you're trying to tell a story about human beings with real feelings and real urges and living a real life, and you're dealing with source material that has eliminated huge components of it. That is one advantage to looking at the memoirs and things that were written many years after, for what you might have lost in the sort of accuracy of memory. I think some of the politeness fell away. It's very challenging to not bring, you know, contemporary political attitudes to your, you know, historical characters, and to still be able to write characters that you like and not have to make them 100% aligned with the way that you think today. It's really challenging. It's really hard. It's definitely one of the hardest things to do. Finding juicy details is actually, it's time consuming, but it's easy. But I think what you're asking, again, the sort of psychological realism of somebody who came out of a different environment is really, really challenging. I suspect that making her younger might have made that slightly easier. She's a little bit more of a sort of tabula rasa in terms of some of her attitudes, and her morality and sensibility starts to become formed very strongly by what she is going through as we as readers are going through it. So that probably made that challenge a little bit easier than in another situation.
So I guess there is time for a last question. Please.
Who was the first character that sort of came to life for you? Like the first one that you sort of really saw the most vividly?
I would be Barnaby. You know, Juliet went through a lot of, she was much older in an initial draft of the book. Finding her took a long time. Barnaby really struck me in a very visceral way. And he's really in the sort of center of the novel in some ways. And I was, and a kind of, force of gravity around which everybody kind of, converges. So, yeah, he was always there very strongly and very clearly.
Well, no other question? No problem. Okay, thank you very much for coming here. And just telling you that the books, actually, The Secret of Raven Point is on sale upstairs. You want to take a look. Yeah. And thank you very much for coming here. Thank you, Jen. And see you soon with the next events of Casa Italiana.
Thank you, Franco.